Morning, friends. 106 years ago, the ULT came forth with its declaration. 239 years ago, the United States came forth with its Declaration of Independence. And there are similarities between the Declaration of Independence by the United States and the similarities between the Declaration of the ULT. The Declaration of ULT speaks for, which allows for the freedom of the inquirer to investigate and study the philosophy, and also to eventually realize the self, the one self of all. The Declaration of the United States allows for the freedom of the individual. In order for an individual to become free, one has to have, first of all, freedom of mind, and freedom of physical freedom. That's the lowest of the various forms of freedom. You have to have freedom of mind, freedom of conscience, etc. The ULT speaks forth those ideas. It makes of a man, it stands for the establishment of a man. It allows a man to inquire to his purpose, his meaning, his being for being here on earth. And the Declaration of the United States is a lead into that particular freedom. It was all planned and worked out as to why it becomes a declaration, as one student said earlier this morning, interdependence, whereas the Declaration of Independence comes forth, allowing man to be independent enough to go his own way and think, and the ULT Declaration comes forth later and speaks of interdependence. So we have to have both, the independence of thought to investigate fearlessly the question of what is man, why, who, what we are here, and the independence, the interdependence to, once that freedom has been realized, to see that there is but one self, and that's the self of all that the ULT Declaration speaks of. The talk for today is Adepts and the Birth of America. The talk next week would be Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms, and the reading for today comes from the Bhagavad Gita, Chapter 4, Devotion Through Spiritual Knowledge. Krishna speaks, "Both I and thou have passed through many births, O harasser of thy foes. Mine are known unto me, but thou knowest not of thine. Even though myself unborn of chainless excellence, and the Lord of all existence, yet in presiding over nature, which is mine, I am born but through my own Maya, the mystic power of self-ideation, the eternal thought in the eternal mind. I produce myself among creatures, O son of Bharata, whenever there is a decline in virtue and an insurrection of vice and injustice in the world, and thus I incarnate from age to age for the preservation of the just, the destruction of the wicked, and the establishment of righteousness. Whoever, O Arjuna, knoweth my divine birth and actions to be even so, doth not, upon quitting this his mortal frame, enter into another. For he entereth into me. Many who were free from craving, fear, and anger, filleth my spirit. And who dependeth upon me, having been purified by the ascetic fire of knowledge, have entered into my being. In whatever way men approach me, in that way do I assist them. But whatever the path taken by mankind, that path is mine. O son of Pritha, those who wish for success to their works in this life sacrifice to the gods, and in this world success from their actions soon come to pass. And there will be no meeting today, right? We're studying The Living of the Life by B.P. Wadia. And now we have talk Adepts and the Birth of America.
Good morning, friends. is not just about Adepts and the birth of America, but sort of the profession of the essence of the movement of independence, and what the independence movement in America also spread around the world and started a chain of similar movements in other countries that ultimately resulted in the downfall of monarchies and the rise of more democratic governments, where people, everyday people, could make a difference in their government and in their country. So one of the people that was involved, who really sort of was the key figure in the inspiration of this movement and the spread of these ideas, was Thomas Paine. And his profession of ideal was, the world is my country. To do good is my religion. And this is sort of the underlying theme of this topic today. So how were the Adepts involved in the birth of America in the United States? Well, if we go back to like the 1700s, we would see that theology had a firm foundation in the minds of the people, especially the European peoples. This country was founded primarily, the first peoples to come over were those seeking religious freedom because they were persecuted. The Puritans, though they came here seeking freedom, yet were very dogmatic, and a lot of these sort of religious ideas still held the minds of the people. And there were various creeds and sects, but it was still fairly theologically dogmatic. But around the time of 1776, in the late 1700s, there was the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and in those documents we see that they are very broad-minded. They speak of on behalf of all of humanity. They speak of nature and nature's God. No theological name is given. They talk about the natural rights of man, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the King of England is spoken of as being unworthy to be the head of a civilized nation. They never call it a Christian nation or anything, but they're always appealing to sort of the natural rights of man. And so, what are the natural rights of man? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, choice, freedom of thought, freedom of action, freedom of movement. So in appealing to the British, the Declaration makes an appeal to their native justice, their magnanimity, their sort of idea that all men are created equal and all men have these inalienable rights. And that the amendments establish a freedom of religion and a freedom of choice in how one conducts one's affairs. And prior to that, there was really this hold on how things were done and how a nation conducts itself and how people conduct themselves. So Thomas Paine fits into this. He was a key figure in sort of coining some of these phrases and these ideas and spreading them broadcast among the the American colonies and the Europeans. So Thomas Paine is one theosophist, we could say. It would do well for us to remind ourselves of his example and his sacrifice on behalf of the world. He, it is said, was inspired by the Adepts, and he said that there were two kinds of sort of thought processes that took place in his mind. And one was, he thought from premises to conclusions. And the other, he said, were, well, the first were those produced in him by reflection and the act of thinking. And the second class were those, he said, that bolted into his mind of their own accord. He called them voluntary visitors, and he admitted he was indebted to them for much of the knowledge that he had. And it is known in the theosophical tradition that he was inspired by the Adepts, and that some of these ideas were injected into his mind because he was receptive and because he was a broad thinker and a great writer and a being willing to spend his life, sacrifice it for others and not for personal gain. So this awakening of freedom took place in the last quarter of the 18th century. And if we look back, we can see that really the populace was ready for a new order to commence. And Thomas Paine described sort of that he had this vision, and that he said a vast scene opened itself to the world in the affairs of America. And it appeared to him that unless the Americans changed the plan they were pursuing with respect to the government of England and declared themselves independent, they would shut out the prospect that was then offering itself to mankind through their means. And this vision made such an impression on him that he left England and came to America. And obviously from this resulted the Declaration and a lot of influence upon some of the key figures who wrote the Declaration and the Constitution. He arrived in America in 1774, and he went to Philadelphia and became editor of the Pennsylvania Journal. He came bearing many letters of recommendation from Ben Franklin, who was in London at that time, and Paine was about 37 years old. And they had met in London, and Ben Franklin was greatly impressed with him. So Ben Franklin gave him letters of sort of recommendation to his son-in-law, and who was involved in publishing in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. So he was introduced to the proprietor of the Pennsylvania magazine, and Paine became the editor of this magazine. And it was probably the most important literary periodical of the time. So he was poised in this point in history to get these ideas out and to give them currency, so to speak. So he issued a pamphlet called Common Sense in January 1776. And so powerfully did it impregnate the minds and hearts of the people that it, more than any other factors, produced the Declaration of Independence. And for this is backed up by the word of Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Franklin, and many others. As the movement continued, there were times when, the American colonies felt disheartened by, fighting England because they were such a machine in terms of their military might. And even George Washington, despaired at times. And when he did, he turned to Thomas Paine, who once more, with his writing, with the pen, did more than what the sword could accomplish. And in 1776, he wrote about the crisis, and that, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls," unquote. And from that hour, the war was won. And Washington had it read to all the troops, and it helped buoy their sense of purpose. So it was from that followed, the tenacity of the Americans to that vision, to keep fighting for independence. That he had in his mind's eye, Paine, a new order of the ages we cannot doubt upon reading in his Rights of Man. In chapter 2, he says, "No beginning could be made in Africa, Asia, or Europe to reform the political condition of man. America, she had made a stand not for herself alone, but for the world, and looked beyond the advantage that she could receive." In chapter 4, he says, "The case and circumstances of America present themselves as in the beginning of a world. There is a morning of reason, like a dawn of reason rising upon man on the subject of government that has not appeared before." So he arrived here and made such a, it just sort of solidified these ideas that were sort of under the surface. He brought them into clearer focus. And common sense, the crisis, the rights of man, all helped to keep the ideas blossoming and in current thought, so that they were accessible to everyone. Every person who could read these ideas were about, whereas in the monarchy, it's the king and the ministers that decide what the people should have. So this is a major change. Paine, at one point, Thomas Paine was made secretary of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Continental Congress. And he dared to tell the public things that the public needed to know, despite his situation and how it might affect him personally. He was more than once discredited and disgraced before the people he had served. And on went the war with its tumultuous waves of triumphs and terrible troughs of defeat and despair. But at each hollow point where all seemed engulfed, another of the crisis pamphlets would appear throughout 7 fateful years. At each emptied moment, Paine filled once more the cup of courage. And he spelled out the final triumph, out of, from these troughs, these these despairing moments. He spelled out the vision every step of the way. Within a year, the Pennsylvania legislature made him its clerk, and later he went to France as a secretary to obtain money for the hard-pressed Continental Congress, even though they had personally repudiated him. As much to Paine's influence, the mission was successful, and the French king sent him home with 2,500,000 livres in silver and a convoy ship laden with clothes and military stores. Without that help, the revolution would not have been possible. When one recalls Hamilton's urgent letter to Washington praying for shoes to cover the bleeding feet of his men just prior to the march of Cornwallis, the importance of this mission to France can't be underestimated. In 1782, during the war, though Paine gave all his service to the new United States, the Continental Congress had sort of repudiated him and spoken out against him, but Washington convinced the Congress to give him some financial means to support himself. And they gave him $800 on condition that he should use his pen in support of the country. Little did they know that what motivated him was this movement, even though he himself lived very, almost in poverty, very thriftily. He had no time to serve his own needs, but the nation's. New York State gave him some land, and later they did give him some money. And at the end of the war, he turned to a different kind of service. He had an image for like a bridge made of metal, and he brought this idea to Europe and had replicas made, and in his town, instead of using wood and stone, they were replaced with an iron bridge, and he spread this idea in Paris and London, and much to the admiration of engineers. So he was very forward-thinking. Eventually, he returns to America and lives out his final years in extreme poverty and unrecognized for his sacrifices to America, which is probably the karma of this country, and is very unfortunate. But during the time of the war, there was this fire of liberty that he had lit, and it broke out and spread to France during the French Revolution, where it became sort of excessive and bloody, and it frightened the world. Even those who wished for human progress, still it was, sort of terrifying when people heard about the French Revolution. And in reply to this, he wrote The Rights of Man, a work that served in Europe as much as common sense served in America. And like he leavened the lump here, he did so in Europe as well. His book was suppressed, and all possible copies were confiscated and burnt. Its circulation was made a crime, and the sentence of outlawry was passed upon Paine. It circulated more furiously because it was suppressed, but he was actually imprisoned for 10 months, and he continued to write his manuscript of The Age of Reason in prison. And each day, not knowing whether he would be called to the guillotine or not, he kept writing part 2 of The Age of Reason. And the government of France was changing from one to another, but at last he was set free, he was restored to citizenship, and he got another seat in the convention there until 1795. And Washington said, "Under God, the American people owe their liberty to Thomas Paine more than to any other." He returned to America in 1802 in his 65th year. And he, unfortunately, because he was the center of controversy in these ideas, depending on which way the public was sort of moving from time to time, it's sort of like he was alternating between friend and enemy. And so people, sort of avoided him, and he unfortunately died in poverty in this country. He criticized Washington because during the French Revolution, he was hoping that the new American government would return the favor of help to the French that the French had given us. And Washington, wanting to protect the new government, did not give any help. And Paine did criticize Washington for that, and that did cost him like his reputation here, which is unfortunate because he kept his ideals the same, whether he was in America or Europe, and the ideals of the natural rights of man and to do good wherever he was, just like the adepts who serve all of humanity, he was in their eyes a true servant of humanity. And if it wasn't for him, these ideals of democracy, resurrected from the Greek, from centuries past, may not have gained a foothold. So he was just the key figure. His writings were the inspiration for the movement. And as the first speaker said, that this July 4th was the Declaration of Independence. We now see that the real message implicit then and now is that we are interdependent. And Paine was an example of that in his life, trying to help these ideals wherever they were, and to do good wherever it needed to be done, regardless of what it cost him personally in terms of his reputation or fame or whatever. His beginnings were humble. Just to, where did he come from? He was the son of a humble staymaker, and he only went to school till he was 13. But from his earliest childhood, he rebelled against the inhumanity he saw around him, demonstrated in the stocks, the pillory, the gallows that were in the center of every town, and he passed every morning on his way to school. The first pamphlet he ever wrote was a plea to the British Parliament in behalf of overworked and underpaid excisemen. And he was compassionate, and he early on had these feelings of the need for freedom, that people were being unnecessarily oppressed, and this is what was his inspiration. And his mind was open and clear as a tool, a channel, as being a vessel pure enough, whose ideals were pure enough that the Mahatmas could interject and sustain a vision, help him to express it on behalf of all. And in many places do HPB and Judge mention this, and believing that they too were representatives the following century of this vision of interdependence and solidarity. They can speak to that influence in him, recognize it as being of a similar kind, similar in degree. So with that, we'll end the discussion about how Paine was key in the birth of America and how he brought that vision, the inspiration from the Adepts into modern currency. And it's still alive today, in pockets, unfortunately. So we need to, keep these ideas alive.
But just a little additional comment. It seems like he's still criticized to this day in some circles for being so unselfish as he was. It's amazing how we beat up on people who come and really help.
And he's not really given credit where credit is due in the history books, and that's why it's important to, as the theosophical movement today, try to set that straight.
It could be also mentioned that the Freemasons were involved in the revolution in America. Who were the Freemasons, and how were they relation to Paine? Were they working in sync or were they apart? They did have a part to play. Could you speak on that? Who were the Freemasons?
That's a great point. What part did the Freemasons play? Well, the Masons also had this ideal. They were a fraternity, a secret society. Well, not secret. People knew they existed, but they had, I guess they were secret to some degree, and certainly their meetings and what they discussed at the time was a secret. But most of the founding fathers were Masons, and so these ideals completely resonated in terms of, on behalf of all, the natural rights of man as opposed to those belonging to a king through heredity seems really kind of arbitrary when we think about it. So the founding fathers like Hamilton, Jefferson, Franklin, Washington were all Freemasons. I'm not sure if Paine was a Freemason. Was he? I didn't read that he was. I don't think that he was. That doesn't really matter. He still embodied the spirit, and certainly the Freemasons were in key position to help this vision become a reality. You want to add to it? Or?
As a follow-up, I believe somewhere within theosophical literature, it states that Count Saint Germain could be considered the spiritual godfather of America, or something like, because he sent a lot of these Freemasons over to assist Washington with the revolution. And just like you were saying about how Paine was talking about a new vista, a vastness opening up, and I think in the article by Count Germain, he talks about that same sort of vastness opening up and all that sort of thing. And he talks about how he has work to do elsewhere, leaving Europe and something like that.
Yeah, this student did come across some references to Count Saint Germain, that he was involved. He did send key people. He did just tell them, you need to go and do this. And he was said to be in more than one place at one time, and he seemed to be in all the right places at all the right times. And to have a command of the vision that most of the people involved were instrumental in bringing about, but that he seemed to have the overall vision complete even before all these things started to happen. He is credited as being an agent of the Adepts.
Was those messages he received from the Adepts, would you consider them as intuition or just messages from the Adepts?
Well, what is intuition? Intuition, Theosophy says, is the direct perception of truth. And for a mind that is prepared, for a mind that is thinking along those lines, is open to the influence of the Mahatmas. They are constantly giving off beneficent ideation, and those who are open to it are able to receive it. Certainly, considering karma, it's probable that he'd been involved in prior lives in helping, so it's no coincidence that he was in the right place at the right time. But still, every human mind has free will and choice, but he did choose to serve, exactly. So it seems to this student that intuition and the voluntary visitors are one and the same thing. Whether what exactly was the source, higher plane of his own consciousness, which is really synonymous with a Mahatma and Adept. The consciousness is operating at a similar high level. The basis is the same, sure someone could answer that more precisely if they knew the details, but say that it's one and the same.
Another thing, the King of France, by donating the money and clothes to America, sort of cut his own throat. Right? Maybe 2 years later, it came back on him, and he was overthrown. Those ideas of freedom that Paine donated to America brought about the French Revolution itself. So the king, perhaps if America had been defeated, then he would have still been monarch.
Yeah, he was also he was a member of the government of France when he left the U.S., right? So he was doing that kind of stuff.
You spoke earlier on how religion necessarily was separate from church. And from the state, in the Declaration and the Constitution, stuff like that. But just this year, there's the Pope is coming to America. He's a Jesuit, and so is it the United States, and he's speaking to the Congress. So, what, in your view, from a philosophical point of view, has in the past years given rise in the American mind to allow someone who's representing religion, a Jesuit at that, speak to the American Congress? Is there a harmony now between religion and state, or is the state comfortable enough to allow religious figures to speak to them? I'm just having thoughts about that. Do you get the essence of what I'm saying? Whereas at the beginning of the nation, it was just separation, total separation. The state doesn't have anything to deal with religion per se, as you mentioned, nature's God and stuff like that. But now we have, of all people, a Jesuit, and we know how they have been. There's even been stated that they had something to do with the assassination of an American president, Lincoln in particular. So now we have one coming here to speak to the American Congress and thus to the American people through the Congress.
It seems to this student, from a theosophical point of view, that since the Founding Fathers departed and the ideals of the natural rights of man and of nature's God has become somewhat replaced with the Christian God, just because the majority of the citizens were, I don't know if they still are, majority Christian. And it seems to this student that over time that has been eroded away to being religious at times, and certainly there have been a lot of confrontations about church and state. And there's been two camps, those who want to keep it separate, like the Founding Fathers did, and those who want to sort of say nature's deity is the Christian deity, is our deity. So it seems that there has been a drift. Whether the Pope speaking to the Congress, it seems like he's a recognized leader. It's a good move to listen to what other people have to say, but how they're going to react to what he says is what's most important. The Dalai Lama comes here a lot. Other leaders come here a lot. We go to other countries, so it's good to, have relations. But it's also, it seems to this student, good to always keep in mind the founding message. And to be true to that, it seems to this student that it has drifted, and that the Congress no longer works. It does less than the do-nothing Congress did historically. It's been bought by corporations, and that's another discussion. But it seems from a strictly interdependent, theosophical, looking at the level of ideals and the practices and how they uphold that ideal, it definitely seems that we're not being in consonance with those, that we're drifting. And I guess the more we keep these ideals present and try to spread them, because they ring true within each person, because they're based on the solidarity and interdependence of all humanity, which is a fact in nature and law, maybe we can sort of stem that tide a little bit.
Just couple comments. You started out talking about the pilgrims coming to America in search of freedom, but yet they had their own ideas of what religion was. They were looking for religious freedom. When you also threw in the term dogmatic, which seems very appropriate based on this student's understanding of history. Many of them were, but they went fairly quickly from. We had a country of people who were descendants of pilgrims all over the place by the time Thomas Paine comes along, at least along the eastern coast. Yet they came together and put together this Bill of Rights and this Constitution, which was inclusive.
As the speaker said, our faith and conviction should be with the founding fathers. And not only there's a drift, but they're also changing the law. Actually, Congress is changing the law. There is a movement to include religion in the school systems. So, are we going to go backwards or are we going forward is the question here. And there's an article that this student read which states that United States has lived its lifespan of, say, 200 years that the Roman Empire took 2,000 years to do. And what happened to the Roman Empire? They putrefied and dissolved from within. And the same thing is happening here. We can see that our government is having tremendous difficulty working. Congress does not work, and nothing has changed. What about the Supreme Court? They have made cooperation as a person for voting rights. Well, to this student, I do not know how anyone can be on that Supreme Court and sleep on such a decision. So where is the democracy for the people is what this student is asking. Are we a democracy? Do we have a say in our government? What about the policies that are conducted on our behalf all over the world? Are we with it? Or are we going to be with that statement, ye be separate, and stand up for what is right?
It's tough to have a talk like this and stay out of politics, yet Theosophy says let's just not do politics. But yeah, I mean, when we have a government like we have now, of the people, by the people, and for the people, yeah, it's going to swing back. That pendulum is going to swing back and forth, and we hopefully we see that pendulum now going all the way in the wrong direction, and it'll come back. But we don't know what the future will hold, except we have in the writings that there will be the next great civilization somewhere in this particular territory.
Yeah, I think we should return to like what Robert Crosby says, and it's on our program, which I think you can see online. What a glorious thing it is to know where the right road lies. Whatever else may be doubtful, that is sure. And to feel that you are able by your surety to point out the way to others. Help of that kind is greater than all other kinds put together. So, it's essential to keep these ideals current, but it does seem that someone who's so gifted a communicator and in the right place at the right time is needed at this point to help guide our country in another direction. Maybe in the last half of this century, someone like that will appear. The Mahatmas have said that in the last, HPB has said in the last quarter or half of every century, has been an effort to overturn the old order and impress these ideals in the minds of the West. Bring ideas from the ancient East to the West.
Yeah, you sort of touched on some of what I was going to say, but I want to expand the idea of America to both Middle and South America, because the seeds for this new birth, this new growth, this new freedom of mind seems to be in all of the Western Hemisphere. However, it's just that the northern part of the Americas is where all this activity has occurred. And it's interesting that in South America, the church was dominant, and I guess that's why, I guess in terms of economics and political freedom, they are where they are, whereas in the North, you had the Adepts in their activity. So, but to what, just I guess it's basically a comment in that what you were saying, since it was started here in America, in the Western world, then there is hope that it will continue and will flourish in America, because indeed the Adepts were behind the movement, are behind the movement, and they are not just going to desert the movement. It was started here for a reason. It's not going to go elsewhere to Africa, etc. just yet. So it is here in America, but I think, as you say, the birth of America has to be expanded to the Americas, because people coming from Central America, they are Americans too, and the complexion of the Anglo has changed from the majority of folk. It's stated that the white population is in minority now. So these people who are coming from Middle America consider themselves Americans as well. So the whole question of America is beginning to come to fore. In other words, just comment.
And we could apply that dream to the whole world, not just the Americas.
You mentioned Tom Paine and also the Adepts, and the steadfastness of Paine came out to me in your talk, that he was the same in Europe as he was in the U.S., and that's how he got into trouble. So the idea is that we also have the other side, the people's views changing too, and we need to just take that into account.
But when HPB came on the scene in the 19th century, one of the aims is that America stretch a helping hand to India, that we need to bridge the West with the East, so that on each continent one provides what is missing in the other, and that way on the structure of the old with the new ideology, a new civilization can be built.
For the whole world.
Correct.
Because we're all citizens of Earth.
Inclusive of everyone.
So that the world is my country and the do good is my religion, that sounds, even though it's been around amongst the auspice, those particular words seem to be original to Thomas Paine, are they?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How many of us live up to it is the other end of it. He lived up to that statement.
Yeah.
Even though, Washington was such a popular figure after the war, because he didn't lend a helping hand to France, Thomas Paine took the difficult road of, criticizing that decision, and he was reviled for it. And, it cost him his personal security, but he still stood up for what was right, to the ideal, and that is the type of sacrifice that marks a true theosophist that we all aspire to be able to do if we're called upon to do that. When and if, because we will be.
But there was a comment in one of those articles where it said that the next war would not have happened had Washington helped France.
The Civil War may not have happened, it was said, if he had helped France.
Yeah, and also I think Germain was in France, and he was in contact with the king, and through the queen had a session with the king and instructed the royalty what to do in order to save the situation. But the king did not go along with the suggestions made and immediately told his aide, which he was informed not to do so. This statement this student has read in one of those articles. I was wondering if anyone else has read it too. That the Adepts tried to save the situation in France through Count Saint Germain, but that he was not successful, because by the time the king made that decision, Count Saint Germain said the time had passed, he could no longer help them. That they needed to do what he asked them to do when he had first approached them, and the council had occurred because he was able to reach the queen first and asked to speak to the king through her. But I mean, they're everywhere trying to save the situation is also what was put forward, but that sometimes they're not able to change the course of events.
Yeah, I mean, that does bring up the whole idea of moment of choice that we are all confronted with when a time is ripe. And the American independence illustrates, and the French one too, here it was successful, there it was not, resulted in more wars. That should be a warning to us all about maintaining ideals and being steadfast to them, even if it's not popular, and that even professing an ideal means that at some point, we'll be tested with that during a moment of choice, a moment of ripeness.
Courage.
Yeah, we need courage, exactly.
Well, I would like to say that also that I think that it was successful in France too. We have a, quote, democracy in France probably just as much as it is here. It just took longer.
No, it took a lot of beheading, and it could have been prevented.
Reign of terror.
There was a lot of blood spilled here as well.
It wasn't
anyway.
necessary to kill all those people to change the course of history.
Just to tie it up, Paine's idea of religion was one which would bind all men together in one great brotherhood. In 1797, while he was in France, in Paris, he founded an ethical society which promulgated a religion of humanity. 40 years before Auguste Comte used the phrase. It was called the Society of Philanthropists, meaning, as he explained in a letter, God, love, and man. He rendered the word lovers of God and man, or adorers of God and friends of man. Paine argued for the existence of God as a superior cause, affirming that the eternal motion of matter is not an inherent property of matter, but must be derived from a superior source. The Theophilanthropists regarded nature as the only reliable book, quote-unquote, on theology. At their meetings, they sang humanitarian hymns and read from the ethical teachings of the Bible and from Chinese, Hindu, and Greek authors. So it didn't operate for that long, but we can see it's essentially a forerunner of the Theosophical Society, and that it appears in all ages and at all times.
So
in
theosophy,
different
you're saying,
forms.
goes underground from time to time, and this is a time when it
Surfaced.
yeah.
There's an ethical society on 16th Street now that may be related to that one.
Well, this lasted until it was Napoleon stopped it, and that's when that society lost its strength. He prohibited them
How
from
many years
meeting.
around?
Yeah, when
Not
he
sure.
declared himself emperor, that's the opening of that.
Sounds about 35 or 40 years.
There is one in Philadelphia too.
I think it was something.
Okay, thank you so much. And next week, please join us for Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms, and happy interdependence.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we're going to have a short break, and we'll start our afternoon meeting, roundtable discussion on living the life. Thank you for joining us.